here is Jonathan Chait. And he says that polarization has given any major party nominee a high enough floor of support that the term unelectable has no real place in the discussion. That said, the totality of the evidence suggests Sanders is an extremely, perhaps uniquely risky nominee. We do not have a particularly, I want to say, we do not have a particularly strong slate of candidates who can be elected president. There is no Obama who has tremendous political gifts. There is no Clinton who had tremendous political gifts. We don't have one of those in this race. We're also in a very, very specific era with a president that is, with an incumbent president that is really largely, at least in the modern era, completely, I would say, totally unique in terms of their rise. First business person, first person who was not involved in institutional party politics. It's considered uniquely corrupt, who has been grotesque. So the idea that you could even make the assessment that any of these nominees are uniquely risky is absurd. It's absurd. They're all risky. Or they're all not. I mean, the biggest risk is that you're going to have somebody who simply is not like physically up to the task. And I think that really only Joe Biden fulfills that. To say that there's anybody uniquely risky, it has to be Joe Biden. Because Joe Biden is like, he's not taking any questions. He's losing his cool at every. We could play a video of him going after supporters, like a half a dozen supporters. The latest one. Let's play this clip of Joe Biden. Here's a guy who come up to ask him. Joe Biden is so off his game that he is projecting onto people now stuff. Look how easy it was to get under his skin. Joe Biden's approached by a very mild-mannered voter. And Joe Biden is so thrown off by this that he's lobbing weird accusations at him. Here, play this.
I'm going to support you if you win the nominations. We got to get rid of Trump. But what are we going to do about climate change? Now, you say you're against pipelines, but then you want to replace these gas lines. That's not going to work. We got to stop building and replacing pipelines.
You got to go vote for somebody else.
All right, thanks so much, sir. We're going to have you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I'm going to vote you in the general if you treat me right.
Yeah, I know. Well, I'm not.
Well, can I have a picture?
You're asking a picture of me. You're coming up and telling me you don't support me.
No.
My plan. Yeah, you did. You said
I said I would support you in the general.
In the general. I'm looking for a primary.
We're happy to get a number. We can follow up.
That's what I'm looking for, okay?
Just because we're trying to get.
You believe that Bernie can do something by 2030?
I'm actually supporting Tom Steyer.
Well, that's good. He's the guy that did
Thanks
more
so much,
coal
sir. We have a long line.
All right, pause it. So, do you see what happened here? The guy comes up and says, "Look, I want you to know right at the beginning, I'm going to support you in the general. But I want to talk to you about climate change. I'm concerned about your policy about pipelines." And he goes, "Go vote for somebody else." "Well, I'm going to support you in the general." "Yeah, I don't care. I need you to vote right now. So I'm not going to waste my time talking to you." And the guy says, and he goes, "Go vote for Bernie." And he grabs him by the lapel. Like, what kind of guy does this? He physically grabs him by the lapel. "Go vote for Bernie." "Oh, I'm actually voting for Tom Steyer." Now, here's the problem. This guy's so defensive now that he just alienated someone who could have voted for him in the caucus, because Tom Steyer has a very good chance of not making it, not being viable. And so when this guy is sitting in that caucus and Tom Steyer does not have the votes, if this guy's caucusing, he's going to go to somebody else. And Joe Biden just immediately gave away that vote. This is not somebody who is equipped to run a political campaign. It is grueling. It is tiring. If you are letting it get to you in this way, you're simply not equipped to do it. So if you're talking about somebody who's uniquely risky, there's evidence for Joe Biden being uniquely risky. I'm not even sure you can say uniquely risky, but if that's what you're going to write, if you're going to say that one candidate is uniquely risky, and I've just shown you that, and there's a half a dozen of those, literally a half a dozen of those exchanges, maybe more, where Joe Biden is alienated potential votes in the primary, in a caucus. This is literally the first sentence of the second graph. Sanders is uniquely risky. In other words, no one else is as risky as him. If you do not think that Joe Biden is as risky as a bet as Bernie Sanders, then your premise is completely skewed. If you do not think that Pete Buttigieg, a man who is married to another man, when we are 15 years out from when having amendments to state constitutions that gay people should not be able to marry is not also risky. If we've just gone through an election where misogyny undoubtedly played a role, was it determinative? I don't know. But that's also risky. It's all risky. And as soon as you say that one person's uniquely risky, and it's not the one who is actually like literally saying like, I don't vote for me, and because you're voting for Bernie. Oh, it's Tom Steyer. Oh, shoot. I just blew a chance of picking up an actual vote in a caucus state. I'm sorry. This is just, it gives you a sense of just sort of like how well reasoned this piece is. But he goes on to say that this guy is like, now he does make the point. No party nomination, with the exception of Barry Goldwater in 1964, has put forth a presidential nominee with the level of downside risk exposure as Sanders-led ticket would bring. Now, this is just the downside risk exposure he's talking about is not just that Sanders would lose. It is that it's going to hurt down ticket votes. That's conceivable. But the evidence is unclear. He goes on to list positions that Sanders has which are unpopular. He supports things that are popular, but some that are unpopular. Replacing all private health insurance with a government plan. Part of that is how it's phrased and whatnot, but the polling is that as it's been expressed now, it does not have 50% popularity. Banning fracking does not have 50% popularity. Letting prisoners vote, I think, is probably very unpopular, broadly speaking. Decriminalizing the border, I'm not so sure about that. It's probably close. Giving free health care to undocumented immigrants, not popular. Eliminating ICE, not popular. He goes, I'm only listing Sanders positions that are intensely unpopular. I'm not including positions like national rent control and phasing out nuclear energy that I consider ill-advised, but probably won't harm him much with voters. We don't know what's going to harm him for voters. We also know that building a wall was very unpopular. We just don't know. He goes on to say that Sanders seems to have overtaken Warren in part because she spent most of 2019 closing the ideological gap between the two candidates, which made the Democratic Party elites justifiably skeptical about her electability, thereby kneecapping her viability as a trans-factional candidate. But Warren tries to couch her positions in a framework of reforming and revitalizing capitalism that is indeed intended to reassure ideologically skeptical voters. So his argument is that the reason why people abandon Warren was because when she adopted Medicare for all, it signaled to people who worried about electability that wouldn't work in a general. But the fact is that doesn't jibe with the actual time. She was for Medicare for all more so in her ascent than she was in her descent. Her descent came when she started having to backpedal on Medicare for all. When she started to have to explain, when she could not respond or could not weather the storm that came with, I care about costs, not about taxes. Do you understand? Like, her electability issues came up when she was unable to maintain the tension she was trying to create here. Instead of just being strong and wrong, she tried to be right with everybody. That is not the same as saying the position she held, Medicare for all, was problematic. It is the fact that she signaled she could be knocked off her game, which was the initial concern about the DNA. The point is that what we're seeing here is that electability, because we're starting to see Biden falter, right? And why are we seeing Biden falter? Because he's showing a shakiness. His positions have not changed. What we're seeing here is that people make a decision about electability who are outside of politics as a job. It is not based exclusively, and maybe not even predominantly, by their positions, at least in this environment. It is based upon a perception that they are unwavering, that they are strong and it doesn't matter, that they're exuding confidence and they're exuding consistency. Every one of these candidates has a narrative that is a liability. With Warren, it's that you can't be sure where she stands on something. I happen to think that's not true. I happen to think, though, that her campaign has been addressing questions that they shouldn't address. They should just be like, I got this. I don't have to give you a financing plan for my Medicare for all. Bernie Sanders hasn't. He's given 4 areas in which the money could come from. But he's like, that's all you need for this point. We don't give you, when we talk about a $70 billion a year increase in the military budget, we cut taxes. All we gave you was information on where it will not come from. Warren did not need to do that, even to maintain her, I have a plan for that. They got caught up too much in what was a metaphor, and they started, they like, oh, I need to have a single plan, a narrow, granular plan for everything. They did not understand her core brand proposition, as it were. There's a problem with the campaign. That's what people are reacting to. Some people are reacting to it viscerally, like they're not making the analysis that there's something wrong with the campaign. They just feel it because she's not exuding the confidence. She should have kept saying, look, for me, it's about cost. You want to talk about taxes? That doesn't matter. At the end of the day, the money in the pocket of the middle class will be more than it was before. She should have just kept saying that. And they would have kept hammering her. And then you know what? They would have moved on because our news cycle is so fast that no one's going to be, there's not going to be any, the more that they would have hammered that, the more the voters would have appreciated it and understood it. But her campaign, they blinked. That's why she went down. That's why when Joe Biden is blinking all over the place, like literally and figuratively blinking, that's why he's dropping. But Chait sees it through his ideological lens. That it was her embrace of Medicare for all, but yet everyone knows she embraced that from the beginning. Compounding those vulnerabilities is a long history of radical associations. This is Chait saying the socialist label has grown less unpopular, but it's still not popular. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. In part because of, put up that image. The one from McCain that I said. In part because of this. McCain says Obama wants socialism. This is October 2008. This is right before the election, incidentally. And he said this in North Carolina, which I should tell you, Barack Obama won. First time a Democrat won that in a long time. Maybe they didn't care he was a socialist. Maybe this didn't fall into a narrative, although it certainly was the narrative of the Republicans. And here's the problem with the idea that this socialism is, because remember, the name of the game is how do you depress the Democratic vote? Being inconsistent can depress the Democratic vote because it says maybe she's not going to do what she's going to say she's going to do. Being corrupt, and I'm not saying that these people are these things. That's up for you to believe or not. But everybody, there's nobody who's listening to the sound of my voice doesn't believe that these narratives exist. You can say they exist unfairly. Fine. I don't care about that. Being corrupt is something that could depress the Democratic vote. Being racist is something that could depress the Democratic vote. I don't know if Pete Buttigieg is racist, but he definitely, I mean, his own campaign has a problem. Can depress the vote. And I think the idea that if Pete Buttigieg had been in the lead, his lack of actual material deliverance and his flip-flopping would be in a narrative. Now, he may pull something out, in which case, you know, all power to him. The narrative for Bernie Sanders, what is it? He is a radical socialist. How does this depress the Democratic vote? He was in favor of the Ayatollah. Is this really going to depress the low propensity Democratic voters? He praised the Soviet Union. Is this going to depress the low propensity? They don't care about these things. The only thing that I think that could actually depress the low propensity Democratic vote would be if they believed that Bernie Sanders was lying about his proposals. And I do think that there is, and I think people need to acknowledge this, there could be stuff that comes out of like the fact that like he's got 2 houses, 3 houses, or whatever it is. He made $1 million on his book. The question is, does that information in a general election targeted to specific people have enough to make those people think that, yes, Sanders is saying he's going to do X, Y, and Z. I love all that. I don't believe him. I don't know. If there is a risk to Bernie Sanders, that is it. But you do have Republicans and Fox people and this and that. Maybe they'll change their tune later. But they all joke. Even George Stephanopoulos the other day on ABC television. One thing you got to say for Bernie is he's been saying the same thing for 30 years. He believes in what he's saying. That's the one thing they concede about Sanders. And the problem, too, if you're trying to sell this thing that he doesn't believe what he believes in, is the other message that you're going to push first is that he's a radical socialist and he's going to do all these things. And then to try and flip and say, wait a second, I'm going to counter that narrative with he's not going to try and do these things. That's going to be a very hard trick to pull off. You can't say about Joe Biden, he's super corrupt. But the problem with him is that he's really, really not corrupt at all. It's just, that's the problem they have. That's why it's so hard for them to lay a hand on Bernie Sanders. Now, in a general election, they're not going to be able to say things like in a Democratic election, like I think it's perfectly like, he's old. He had a heart attack. You know, that is a liability. But in a general election, no, that is not going to depress Democratic votes. Nobody's going to say, I'm not going to vote for Bernie Sanders because he's too old against Donald Trump. It's just not going to happen. And then the question is, will you lose a bunch of moderates because they're afraid of Bernie Sanders? Or, more importantly, will down-ticket moderates, Elisa Slotkin is someone that they talk about. She is in a Michigan district directly north of Ann Arbor. She was the one who we talked about her in the context of impeachment, where she came out and said she's going to do impeachment. And she was one of those frontline Democrats who came out and said she was going to do it. She does not support Medicare for all, but she just supports a public option, having government negotiate drug prices. I'm not sure where she is on things like free college, et cetera, et cetera. She is in a R plus, I don't know, 5 or 6 or 7 Michigan district. And the question is, does Bernie Sanders hurt her there? I don't know. I don't know if Bernie Sanders hurts her more than Pete Buttigieg would or Elizabeth Warren would. Maybe Joe Biden doesn't hurt her. We just don't know. We don't know. There is a lot of political science that argues that actually doesn't necessarily work like that more often than not. That the coattails actually go the opposite direction. That local candidates feed into this as much as the presidential candidates. We don't know. Getting back to Chait, he said, the quality of the candidate is not the only or even the main determinant of election outcomes, and having popular views is only one factor in the quality of candidates. Still, political science has generally found that, all things being equal, the electorate tends to punish ideological extreme candidates. Yes, but things are not equal. This is not a vacuum. This is the most unique election we've had in modern times. There's just no doubt about it, right? I mean, there's no question about this. And then he goes on to create a little bit of a straw man. That is why Bernie's succeeding. And it's really just an argument he's having with people who are online. Hillary Clinton's surprising defeat created an opportunity for the left to promote an alternative theory for how the party could and should compete. It deemed Donald Trump's win a sign that capitalism had created such distress that voters were now rejecting conventional politicians altogether and open to radical alternatives who might promise to smash the failing system. Now, he is conflating ideological radicalism with an anti-establishment quality. You can have, those things can be distinct. Barack Obama was an anti-establishment candidate. He didn't use that language but change. That's what that is. Change. And this is going to change America. And really what the unspoken anti-establishment or establishment he was running against was the white establishment, was the dominance, was white supremacy in its sort of like most academic sense. People like change now. They are unhappy with things. Donald Trump ran as a change agent. And the question isn't what they're going to do to change. I don't think people get that granular with it. I think if they did, people would realize, like, what is exactly that Obama is going to change? Wasn't a policy thing. It was just a feel. And people were like, I'm willing to do it. What was Trump going to change for people? He goes on by saying, indeed, by this reasoning, Democrats would do better, not worse, by nominating a more left-wing candidate. See, there he is, again, conflating the outsider with political ideology. Pete Buttigieg, the reason why he was doing so well early on, I'm convinced, was less about his ideology and more about the idea that he was outside, that he was fresh. That's why everybody's running against Washington, who could distance themselves more credibly from the discredited establishment. See, Chait makes the mistake of, one, understanding that the establishment represents a form of whatever you want to call it, center right, center left, whatever he would call it, and that the left-wing candidates represent an anti-establishment, but he's conflating these things. He thinks they're the same thing, and he's using them interchangeably, and they're not. Because people don't look at the ideology. They look at the idea of, like, is this guy different? Is this woman different? Are they going to change things? It doesn't matter what the change is going to be. And he goes, this theory had two clear tests. Jeremy Corbyn, which I think is silly. I'm sorry. Jeremy Corbyn had all sorts of liabilities that aren't the same as Bernie Sanders. Again, Jeremy Corbyn is the perfect run if you are ideological in your analysis, which I will grant. There are definitely people on the left here who were completely ideological in their analysis. Chait doesn't realize that he is too. It's just he's coming from a different ideology, but he's just as ideological to presume that there's this huge lesson to be learned with Corbyn. And he goes, a second example closer to home is even more relevant. In the months leading up to the 2018 midterm elections, the Democratic Party was the subject of bitter and widespread criticism from its left wing. The party's strategy was to flip the House by recruiting moderate candidates who would avoid controversial left-wing positions and instead focus attention on Trump's agenda, especially his effort to eliminate Obamacare. The left predicated the strategy would fail. Only an inspiring progressive agenda could mobilize enough voters to win back the House. I'm not sure that's actually what the left was predicting. I think the left was saying this is an opportunity to actually push the margins because people are going to be voting against Trump. But put that aside. And then he quotes critiques, Adam Green, Neil Soroka from Democracy for America, Zephyr Teachout, Ryan Cooper saying their strategy was stupid. And as we now know, he writes, it was a good strategy to win the House. Democrats flipped 40 seats. Tellingly, while progressives managed to nominate several candidates in red districts, Kara Eastman in Nebraska, Richard Ojeda in West Virginia, and others, any of whose victory they would have cited as proof that left-wing candidates can win in Trump districts, not a single one of them prevailed in November. Our revolution went 0 for 22. Now, that's including primaries, incidentally. Now, Kara Eastman and Rachel Bitkofer, who I think agrees that Sanders is risky, but not for the same reasons, discounts what Chait is saying. She was able to predict before we even knew who the primary winners were how many seats the Democrats would pick up, which suggests that the reason why the Democrats won had nothing to do with their positions. It had to do with people wanting to come out to vote against Donald Trump. What we do know is that the DCCC put a lot of money behind their candidates in the primaries. And with a candidate like Kara Eastman in Nebraska, they put nothing behind her. No support. She lost by barely 2 percentage points. And everybody agrees that were there support there, she would have won. So the bottom line is, I don't know if you need to have progressive challengers in every red district or every purple district to win. I don't know if that's the case. But that's not the argument that Chait's making. Chait's making that the fact that moderates won in these purple districts in the general is evidence that Bernie Sanders can't. And there's no basis for that whatsoever. In fact, I would argue the other, because we knew that the candidates, regardless of their positions, would win. or at least it was predicted by Bitkofer, that maybe looking at the ideological question is not relevant in this instance. And really, where did Hillary Clinton lose votes? Whose votes did she lose that didn't make her win? It was reliable Democratic voters who did not come out. 4 million Obama to nobody votes. Hundreds of thousands of Obama to nobody votes in those states, those contested states. Those are the votes you need. You don't need to have people in Nebraska vote for you. They're not going to. They're not going to vote for any of the Democratic candidates. I can tell you that right now. So I think it's important to... He goes on, at this point, there's hardly any serious evidence to believe that the best strategy to defeat Trump is to mobilize voters with a radical economic agenda. I don't know if that's the best strategy. I think the question is not so much what the best strategy is. The question is, who's the best candidate? Who's the least risky of candidates? And I don't know that there's an answer for this. But I can tell you there's definitely an answer to the question, is Bernie Sanders uniquely risky? And the answer is absolutely no. And he says, Trump's election strategy revolves around painting his opponents as radical and dangerous. You may not like me, he will argue, but my opponents are going to turn over the apple cart. What? This is what he is saying that Trump is going to do. That they're going to...
It's not quoted.
Huh? No, it's not a quote. Because Donald Trump is not going to say that. Is there anybody in the suburbs? Because this is who supposedly that message would resonate with, right? Is there anybody in the suburbs who's going like, yeah, the apple cart feels really stable right now. This is how I want to live the next 4 years. With this Trump stuff is going to die. Like, I don't want to go from the frying pan to the fire. Is there anybody in the suburbs who are saying like, this is what I want politics to be like? They just want it to be quiet. And the only thing they know is that with Donald Trump, it's not. And they could say Bernie Sanders may be just as loud, but how could he be? And let's face it, there was a lot of people who said the Republican Party will squelch Donald Trump. They will keep him in line. Don't worry. It'll be okay. People can say that about the Democratic Party and they'll be right in terms of Sanders, or it's a better bet that they're going to constrain Bernie Sanders more than the Republicans were ever going to constrain Donald Trump. All right. I completely miscalculated on how long I was going to be talking about.
I think we need